Cormac spoke the first name of the tally as the tide turned, the way 8 generations of speakers had spoken it before him, and Tamsin mouthed the words with him from the front row because she could not help it. The whole of Selkenshore stood packed on the harbor wall in the cold morning sun, fishers and netters, and the alderman in his good coat, and above them the speaking steps climbed the cliff in worn gray switchbacks toward the ledges where the dragons had once come down to listen. Bay the First, who cut the compact into stone with Tickluna the Crag, her grandfather said, his voice carrying the old cadence, 3 beats and a fall, the rhythm her father used to drum on the kitchen table with 2 fingers. Bay the Second, who carried the storm word through the winter of the black ice. Bay the Third, who buried his own son and spoke the tally the same night, because the count does not stop for grief. The count does not stop for grief. Tamsin had heard that line 100 times, and still it landed in her chest like a dropped stone, because her father should have been Speaker the Ninth, and her father was 4 years under a cairn on the headland, and the count had gone on without him, as if he had been a wave that broke and slid back. Cormac came down the line of the dead, name by name, deed by deed, to himself. Vay the Eighth, he said, who keeps the steps and waits? Then he turned to the part of the tally that named the living, the witnesses of the blood, the proof that the line still ran. He named her Uncle Brem, who had moved down coast and come back for the day, standing with his cap in his hands. He named Brem's boys, Tad and Ori, 11 and 9, scrubbed and solemn. He named the baby Brem's daughter, 8 months old and asleep against her mother's shoulder, because a babe in arms counted as blood and was entered as blood. He did not name Tamsin. She stood 3 feet from him, close enough to see the salt crusted in the seams of his coat, and his eyes went over her the way a man's eyes go over a mooring post and on to the alderman, and the recitation rolled forward without her in it. 14 years old, the only child of the heir who had died, and the tally of her own house passed over her head like weather. Nobody gasped. That was the worst of it. Nobody so much as shifted their boots, because everyone on the wall had known it was coming. Daughters were not entered. Daughters had never been entered. The tally named the line, and the line ran through sons, and where there was no son it ran sideways to a nephew or to a fostered boy, and that was the form, and the form was older than the harbor wall they stood on. The line requires a candidate, Cormac said. The quickening will be run before the season ends. The House of Vay puts forward Colm Brant, son of the harbor master, to be fostered to the steps and tried by the stages. Colm stepped up beside him, 16, broad through the shoulders, his ears burning red. He was a decent boy. That made it worse, too. Tamsin watched him take the chalk slate from her grandfather's hands, the slate her father had held, and she made her face into the flat calm she had practiced 4 years to perfect, and inside her something said, steady and quiet as the tide. That is mine, not the slate, the count. The count is mine. The squall came over the brows 20 minutes later, while half the crowd was still on the wall, and it came without one breath of warning. There had been a time, and Tamsin was old enough to remember it, when no weather touched Selkenshore unannounced. A dragon would lift off the high crags an hour before the wind turned, swing one slow circle over the harbor, and call down the storm word in the carrying voice. And the boats would run in laughing at how easy it was. 9 generations of that. Weather word from the crag parliament, and in return the town kept the ledges provisioned in the lean months, kept the sound horns clear, kept the tally, kept the compact. 3 years now, the crags had been silent. 3 years of reading the sky like any other coast, and the sky over the Skerries was a liar. The wind hit the harbor mouth like a thrown door. Tamsin saw the water go from gray to white in the time it took to shout, saw the dayboats that had gone out at dawn caught a half-mile off the shelf with their nets still down, saw with her heart climbing into her throat, the blue hull of the Taro boat among them, her mother's boat, heeled so far over that the keel flashed. After that, there was no ceremony left in the day. There was rope, and the lifeboat going out into a sea like boiling milk, and old men swearing at knots their fingers were too cold to tie. Tamsin worked the wall with the rest, hauling lines, and did not let herself look up at the crags more than once. Once was enough. The ledges stood empty in the flying spray. The Parliament watched the shelf the way you watch a stranger's field. Whatever was drowning down here was not theirs. They got the boats in, all but one. The Taro boat came last, half-swamped, her mother bailing with a cut above her eye and her 3 crew gray-faced, and the one they did not get was old Hesper's smack, which went onto the teeth at the harbor mouth and broke. Hesper they pulled out alive. His boy Davin they pulled out alive. The boat, 30 years of a family's living, went to planks in 20 minutes, and the town stood and watched it go because there was nothing else to do. 3 years, somebody said behind Tamsin, low and bitter. 3 years they've let us drown blind. And the speaker stands up there saying names at the water. She turned to see who had said it and met only closed faces. But it had been said and it had been heard, and it sat in the town after that like a coal in wet straw. Her mother would not go to the surgeon until the boat was pumped. That was Nesve for you, born Nestero, who had married into the speaking line and been treated for 15 years like a rope that had come aboard with the cargo. She stood on her deck with a rag pressed over her eyebrow and ran the pump handle herself until Tamsin climbed down and took it from her by force. You saw the wall, Mother said. It was not a question. I saw it. He looked past you. He follows the form, Tamsin said, and heard how dead her own voice came out. The form doesn't have me in it. Ness was quiet for a moment, working the rag against her eye. The cut was not deep. Head wounds just like to perform. Your father used to say the form was a boat, she said. He said you maintain a boat or it kills you. He never said you drown yourself to spare the boat. She looked up at the crags then, at the high ledges red in the stormlight, and her face was harder than Tamsin had ever seen it. Something is ending up there, Tam. Everyone's pretending it isn't, and it is. The envoy came at slack tide the next morning, and so the whole town saw what ending looked like. She came down off the crags in 3 long descending turns, a sea-gray dragon the size of a fishing smack, wings holding the cold air the way a gull holds it, and put down on the harbor wall where the tally had been spoken the day before. Up close, she was nothing like the shapes Tamsin had grown up watching from below. Her scales were the dull pewter of winter water, scarred white at the wing roots, and her eyes were the orange of banked embers, and when she folded her wings, the sound was like sails coming down. Cormac Vey went out to meet her alone as the form required with the chalk slate under his arm. Tamsin stood in the crowd at the chain and watched her grandfather, who was 71 years old, walk the length of the wall toward the first dragon to touch Selkinshore's stone in 3 years, his back straight as a mast. Whatever else he was not a coward. She held that thought the way you hold a splinter. Speaker! The dragon's voice carried to every ear on the harbor without effort, a low rasp with bell bronze under it. They learned the human tongues fast and kept them for centuries. Her father had told her once. They think our words are small and easy to carry. Like shells, envoy, Cormac said. Selkinshore hears you. I am Seska, son of the Crag Parliament. The dragon's head swung slowly, taking in the wall, the boats, the broken white spine of Hesper's smack still on the teeth. I carry one word, and it is this. Ashvaran the Eldest is dying. The sound the town made was not quite a sound, more a tightening. Tamsin's hands closed on the chain. Every child of the shelf knew the name. Ashvaran the Old Verity, eldest of the Crag Parliament, who had been old when Bay the First climbed Tekloon's stair, who held the compact in living memory because she was the last who had been alive at the making of it. You saw her perhaps twice a year, a shape like a headland moving against the high snow. Children measured unbelievable things by her, big as Ashvaran, old as Ashvaran. The eldest holds the compact, Seska said. When she goes into the wind, the compact goes with her, unless it is renewed on the moot ledge before her last breath. That is the law of our kind. It is older than yours. The ember eyes came down and fixed on Cormac, and Tamsin saw her grandfather hold the look and saw what it cost him. There are those in the Parliament who say, let it lapse. 3 speakers' lifetimes we have called the weather for this shore. And what stands on the shelf below now? A line that no longer reaches us. A voice we have stopped hearing. The Parliament has agreed to this much, and no more. If a voice worth answering stands on the moot ledge before the eldest's last breath, the compact may be made again. If none comes, the ledge is close. The shelf returns to the wind. Your boats will read the sky alone, as they did yesterday. And how long, Cormac said, and his voice did not break, but it had sand in it, does the eldest have? She will not see the equinox, Seska said. Send your voice up the stair before then, speaker, if you have one. She was gone in 2 wing beats, the wind of her leaving knocking caps off along the wall, and Selkinshore stood in her wake and understood, all together, in silence, that it had just been given a season to justify 9 generations. That night the Vey house was full of men and lamp smoke. The alderman, Garrick Hale, with his chain of office still on from the morning, Brem down from the loft where his boys slept. Colm Brant and his father, the harbour master. They sat around the long table where Tamsin's father had once drummed the tally cadence with 2 fingers, and they talked over each other about provisioning and timing, and whether the boy could be made ready, and Tamsin carried the pot and filled the cups and was no more present to any of them than the iron hook above the fire. The stages take what they take, her grandfather said. He had the mouthstone out on the table, the smooth black basalt tablet, palm-sized, that the candidate carried up Tekloon's stair at the 4th stage, with the first names of the compact cut into both faces, human on one side, dragon on the other. He was polishing it with a cloth as he talked. He polished it every night. Tamsin doubted he knew his hands were doing it. The tally, first. He learns it whole to the cadence, no slate in his hand. Then the ash cup. Then the long listening, a night on the steps alone in silence, until one of them chooses to speak to him first. That is the gate most candidates fail. You cannot force it. You cannot fake it. They speak first or they do not. And if they don't, Garrick Hale said, then he stands there every night until they do, or until the eldest dies and it stops mattering. Cormac set the stone down, then the carrying up the stair alone. Then the first question before the Parliament. Then the answer borne down to the town, spoken whole, however hard it lands. Then the sealing, if she grants it. 7 stages. No speaker in the line ever did them in less than a year. You're asking the boy to do it in a season? Said the harbor master. I am asking the boy to do it because there is no one else, Cormac said, flat as slate, and in the silence after it, Tamsin set the pot down on the hearthstone with very great care, because the alternative was throwing it through the window. Colm caught her eye across the room. To his credit, and she hated that it was to his credit, he looked sick. He had grown up 2 doors down. He had watched her father walk her up the lower steps when she was 6, her hand swallowed in his big one, learning the names of the ledges. He knew. The whole town knew, and the knowing changed nothing, and her grandfather picked up the mouthstone and went back to polishing it as if the matter were weather, regrettable, and beyond appeal. She went out the back into the cold and climbed, not the speaking steps proper. She was not fool enough to be seen on those. There was an older way, a half-collapsed scramble up the east shoulder of the brows that the Gulls owned, to a shelf of stone perhaps 10 feet wide that her father had shown her the summer before he died. The Gull Step, he had called it, a landing of some older stair that had fallen into the sea before even the compact. From it you could see the whole harbor and the high crags and the first stars over the skerries, and nobody in Selkenshore could see you. The shelf wall, in the low angle of dusk light, was covered in chalk marks, hundreds of them, in tidy rows of 5 going back 4 years, 1 mark for every time. Tamsin took the stub of chalk from the tin she kept wedged in the rock, faced the dark mass of the crags the way the form said the speaker must face. The listener, and began, quietly, in the cadence her father had taught her at the kitchen table, 3 beats and a fall, the tally of the line of Vey. She spoke the 8 speakers, name by name, deed by deed, with none of the stumbles she had owned at 10. Then she spoke the part the form did not contain, the names she had gathered this last year, from grave markers on the headland and the brittle rolls in the netting house, where births were written down with no regard for whether the tally would ever want them. The daughters, Maren Vey, who had kept the steps provisioned through the famine winter while her brother lay fevered, and got no name for it. Etta Vey, who had taught 2 speakers the cadence before they could walk, because she had it perfect and her husband did not. Sister after sister, daughter after daughter, the dark half of the count, all the way down to the end of what she knew, and then the last name, the one she added the way you set a candle in a window. And Tamsin Vey, she said to the listening dark, daughter of Aaron, who keeps the count whether they enter her or not. She made the chalk mark. 500 and some now. She had stopped totting them up. Far above her, where the crag face went up sheer into the last red light, something moved. She had half noticed it before evenings this past year. A settling sound like a rockfall that never fell. A shadow along the high gallery that the light never quite caught. Gulls did not nest that high. Wind did not sound like that. Like breath drawn slow through a chest the size of a boat shed. Tamsin stood very still, chalk in her fist, heart going like a halyard in a gale, and watched the dark above her until the cold drove her down. Whatever it was, it had been there before. Whatever it was, it had not come tonight. It came every night she spoke. She did not know that yet. The quickening began for Colmbrant 2 mornings later, and Selkenshore turned out to watch the way a town turns out for a launch its suspects will not float. The first stage was the tally itself, spoken whole from memory at the foot of the speaking steps. No slate, no prompting, the cadence exact. Cormac stood before the boy with his arms folded into his sleeves, and the town ringed them at a respectful distance, and Colm, pale as a split sail, began. He was not stupid, and he had worked. He got the 8 speakers in order. He got most of the deeds. But the cadence, the 3 beats and a fall that turned a list into a count, that made the names ring off the cliff like struck iron, the cadence was simply not in him, and every soul on the shelf could hear it wasn't. He spoke the tally the way a man reads out a cargo manifest, accurately and from outside. When he finished, the silence had an ache in it. Again tomorrow was all Cormac said. Tamsin stood at the back of the crowd with her mother and kept her face flat and her hands in her pockets. And inside her the cadence ran along under Colm's flat delivery the whole time, correcting it, the way your foot taps the true rhythm under a bad drummer. Tap, 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 fall. Her father's 2 fingers on the kitchen table. It was not knowledge to her, it was pulse. He'll get it, somebody near her said without conviction. He'll get the words, said old Hesper, who had lost his boat to the silence of the crags and was past politeness. You don't sing a man into a rope by getting the words. The ash cup came the following week, and that one was private. But Tamsin knew the shape of it the way she knew the shape of her own hands, because her father had talked her through every stage on the Gull step the summer he died. Not as instruction, never as instruction, only as a man talks about the thing he loves to the person he loves. The candidate kept a night vigil at the line's own hearth. At dawn he was given the cup, water, salt, and a fingerprint of ash taken from the hearth of every speaker back to the first, the ash jar passed down and added to at every death, so that the candidate drank the line's whole history of fire. You will taste every winter they kept anyone alive, her father had said. It is foul, and you will want it never to end. Colm kept his vigil in the Vey house. Tamsin lay awake above, listening to him shift and cough by the fire below, an honest boy keeping somebody else's night. At gray dawn she heard her grandfather come down, heard the scrape of the ash jar lid, heard the murmured form, heard Colm drink and gag and apologize, and her grandfather say nothing at all. That evening she climbed to the Gull step with a cup of her own, harbor water, salt from her mother's net shed, and ash. Not from the hearth downstairs. She would not steal from the jar. That ash belonged to the form even if the form did not belong to her. She had something the form did not know existed. The summer before he died, her father had banked a driftwood fire on the Gull step itself, one midsummer night when they had stayed too late watching the high ledges, and she had kept a charred knuckle of it in her chalk tin for 4 years without ever once asking herself why. She crumbled a fingerprint of her father's fire into the cup and stood facing the crags and spoke the words of the stage, alone in the cadence, and drank. It was foul, salt and char and cold harbor water, the whole history of keeping people alive on this shore in one swallow, and her eyes stung, and it was not the taste, and she did not want it to end. High above her in the failing light, the shadow lay along the gallery and did not move. She was watched the whole time and did not know it, or did not let herself know it, which on that shore amounted to a different thing. It was the third stage that broke the season open. The long listening. The candidate climbs at dusk to the mid-steps, alone, and stands in silence, and waits to be spoken to. Not calling, not naming. The whole stage was a single discipline, the discipline of shutting up, her father had said, laughing. The one stage you cannot rehearse, because its entire content is whether they want to talk to you. A dragon must speak first. Until one does, you are no candidate at all. You are a person standing on a stair. Colm went up the first night, and the town watched his lantern climb and stop, and watched it stand there until dawn grayed the skerries, and watched it come down. Nothing had spoken. Nobody was surprised, and that was its own kind of grief. Even the boy's father had stopped pretending the crags would answer, and the question moving through the town now, in doorways, over net mending, was not whether the compact could be renewed, but what down-coast harbors took refugee boats kindly. The second night, nothing spoke. The fifth night, nothing. Colm came down the steps the 8th gray dawn with his jaw set wrong, and as he passed the chain where the early crews stood, he stopped in front of Cormac and said, loudly enough that it could never afterward be unsaid, "They don't look at me, speaker. Whatever's up there watching, it watches past me. The way you watch a gate, waiting on someone else." He swallowed. "I'll climb as long as you tell me to climb, but I'm not the one it's waiting for, and everyone on this wall knows who is." He did not look at Tamsin when he said it. He looked at the sea. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 4 years, and it dropped into the town like a torch into a tar barrel. Cormac Vey turned on his heel and walked to the Vey house, and Tamsin, summoned by no word but a jerk of his chin, followed, and the door banged, and the whole of Selkenshore outside pretended very hard not to be listening. "You will stay off the steps." Her grandfather's voice was low and even, which was how he was when it mattered. He saved his shouting for things he did not mean. "You have been climbing. Don't insult us both. There is chalk on the east shoulder. There has been chalk on your sleeve every morning for 4 years. Your mother darns rock tier in your knees that no deck on this harbor would put there. I have let it lie, because what a grieving child does in the dark is her own affair. It is no longer in the dark. The town is saying your name now, and every hour they spend saying it is an hour the boy loses, and the boy is all we have." The boy stood on the mid-steps 8 nights, Tamsin said, and they looked past him. 4 years of flat calm went out of her like a tide going out. All at once, fast. You stood on this wall after the tally, and they looked past you 3 years running. You know what it is to stand in front of them and not be seen. You know it better than any man alive, and you do it to me on the wall in front of the whole shelf, with the form for a tong so you don't have to touch it. "The form is the rope," Cormac said. "You don't cut the rope because you dislike the knots." But she was already through it. Father entered me. She had never said it out loud. It came up out of her like something with barbs, not on your slate. Here. She struck her own chest with the flat of her hand. "Every night at that table, 3 beats and a fall, since I was 5 years old. You'd gone up to trim the lamps, and he'd drummed the cadence and walked me down the count, and when I had it perfect, all 8, the deeds, the falls, he put his hand on my head and said, "There's the 9th voice, whatever the slate says." The night before the rockfall took him. The very night before. So enter the boy speaker, run the boy up the stair. But the count is in me, he put it in me, and when she dies up there, the last thing of his that breathes on this shelf besides me is going to die unanswered because you would not say one name. The silence in the room had her father in it. Both of them could feel him there, and neither would say so. A daughter has never been entered. Cormac said at last, each word laid down like a man laying chain. Not once in 9 generations. You think I made the form. The form made me. It made him. His hand had found the mouse stone on the table without his leave. His thumb moved on it, that endless polishing. If I put you on those steps and the Parliament takes it as mockery, a child, a girl, the line scraping its barrel, they close the ledges that hour and the compact dies of my softness, and 400 people lose the shore their dead are buried in. Against that, what is one name? I will not bet the town on my own blood's wanting. That is the whole of it. Now stay off my steps. They were never your steps? Tamsin said. The form says they belong to whoever the dragons answer. And she walked out past him into the wind, shaking and climbed, in full day, with half the harbor watching to the gull step, because there was no longer any reason on earth to hide. She stood on her shelf of stone with its 500 chalk marks, and the wind off the skerries took her hair, and she faced the crags, and for the first time in her life she spoke the tally to them in daylight, full-voiced, 3 beats in a fall, the 8 speakers and the deeds, and then the daughters, Marin who provisioned the famine winter, Edda who carried the cadence, all 26 of the names she had dug out of gravestone and netting roll, the dark half of the count, ringing off the cliff face for the first time since any of those women died. And Tamsin Vey, she finished, into the enormous quiet, daughter of Aaron. Who keeps the count whether they enter her or not? You've been listening for a year, I've heard you breathing. If I'm nothing, tell me I'm nothing, and I'll go down and mend nets and never trouble this cliff again. But you'll say it. After a year of listening, you owe the count that much. Speak first. I'm done waiting to be allowed. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. Long enough for the cold to start in on her. Long enough to feel exactly how small a girl is on a 10-foot shelf under 1,000 feet of stone. Then the high gallery moved. It did not move the way the envoy had moved, quick and seaman-like. It moved the way a headland would move if a headland chose to, a grinding, deliberate vastness detaching itself from the crag it had lain along like a stratum of the rock itself, and it came down the cliff face, not flying but climbing, claw over claw, each hold cracking off echoes like the calving of ice, until the whole sky over the gull step was wing, and the shelf shook, and Ashvaran the Eldest, the old Verity, last living memory of the making of the compact, set her head down on the stone before Tamsin Vey. Her head alone was longer than the tarot boat. Her scales were the gray of weathered slate, going white as bone along the jaw, lichen growing in the seams of her like an old roof. One eye, amber gone milky at the rim, found Tamsin and held her, and the heat of her breath rolled over the shelf like the opening of an oven door, smelling of rain on hot stone. Below them, the harbor had gone absolutely still. Boats stood with their oars lifted. The chain was lined with faces. Cormac Vey stood at the foot of the steps with his hands still on the door he had slammed, watching the eldest of the crag Parliament do for his granddaughter what nothing on those crags had done for him in 3 years. Small voice. Ashvarn spoke, and Tamsin felt it in the stone of the shelf, in her back teeth, a voice like a tide moving through a sea cave, slow and immense and unbearably tired. Every dusk for a year I have come down to this gallery to hear a child say the names of the dead in the old cadence, and every dusk you have said at the end, a name I do not find on any slate. I am dying. I do not spend my climbs idly. So before this shelf and your whole small town, I will spend one. The milky amber eye came closer, until Tamsin stood in the amber of it like a fly in sap. You have spoken first, after all, you will notice. The stage does not say a dragon must speak kindly. It says one must choose. I have chosen. Now answer, Tamsin, daughter of Aaron, keeper of unentered names. Why do you count the left-out ones? The whole shelf, the whole watching harbor, her grandfather, the wind itself, waited on a 14-year-old to open her mouth. Because a count with holes in it isn't a count, Tamsin said. It's a story the counters like better. My father's in a cairn because the weather word stopped, and your Parliament let it stop because they say our line went too quiet to answer. Maybe it did, but I'll tell you when it went quiet. It went quiet every time it dropped a name that carried the cadence and kept one that couldn't, until all it had left was form. You've been listening to me a year, Eldest. You know exactly where the line's voice went. It went out the side door with the daughters. I'm not asking you to make me speaker. I'm telling you the count is bigger than the slate, and I can prove it, because I am standing on the proof, 26 names deep. The breath that came out of Ashvaron then moved the chalk dust on the wall in little ghosts. It might have been a sigh. It might, in something that vast, have been a laugh. 9 generations, the eldest said, and the first one of you to say it is a girl they would not write down. The great head lifted up and up until she stood against the evening sky like the brows themselves, and her voice rolled out so the whole harbor had it, every word, and there would never afterward be any argument in Selkenshore about what had been said. Hear me, Shelf Town. The stage called the long listening is past, not by the candidate on your slate, by the candidate on mine. What your parliament of one old man does about that is his own weather. Mine meets at the dark of the moon, and I am still, until my last breath, its eldest. The eye came down once more to Tamsin, and the next words were quiet, for the shelf only. Finish the stage's small voice. Come up the stair before I go into the wind. There is a thing about the compact that your line forgot so long ago that they no longer know there is a hole where it sat. You count left out names. So did we, once. Ask me the right question on the moot ledge and I will die in better company than I feared. Then the wing came over like weather, and the shelf shuddered, and she was aloft, one tremendous wallowing beat, and then terrible grace, rising along the cliff face toward the high gallery, and Tamsin Vey stood alone on the gull step with 500 chalk marks and the eyes of every living soul in Selkenshore on her, and from the foot of the steps her grandfather looked up across all that distance, and even from here she could see that something in the set of him had cracked through, like ice in the first south wind, and she could not yet tell what would come up through the crack. What came up through it first was not her grandfather at all. It was the Parliament. They came the next noon, 2 of them, and the difference from Seska's visit was the difference between a letter and a writ. The first was Seska herself, putting down on the harbor wall with her wings angled in what even a human could read as unease. The second came down behind her like a thrown anchor, a dragon half again her size, the deep rust black of old wreck iron, ridged along the spine with scar tissue where ridge plates had been and were gone. He did not fold his wings so much as slam them shut, and when his head swung over the chain, the front rank of the crowd stepped back into the second. Vargoth, somebody whispered, and the name went along the wall like a draft under a door. Even Selkenshore knew that name. Vargoth of the High Winter Ledges, who had argued for letting the compact lapse since before Tamsin was born, who was said to have lost a brood sister to a human harpoon crew down the coast a century ago, and to have been waiting out the compact's death ever, since with the patience of a creature who measures grudges in generations. Cormac went out to them with the slate. Tamsin, this time, was called out too, by Seska, by name which sent its own ripple along the chain. She stood beside her grandfather on the open wall, with the rust-black dragon's shadow lying over them both like a tarpaulin, and she made herself stand the way her mother stood on a pitching deck. So, Vargas' voice had none of the eldest tide cave depth. It was dry, precise and unpleasant, the sound of a keel grinding on shingle. This is the unentered name. The eldest spends her dying climes on a chalk-keeping child, and half the Parliament weeps at the poetry of it, and I am sent down to look at the wonder myself. The head came down level with Tamsin, close enough that she could see her own reflection stand in the dark of his eye. Understand me, small voice. I do not dispute what you are. I dispute what you are worth. The eldest hears a child say lost names and calls it proof your kind can keep faith. I call it proof of the opposite. You stood on that shelf and indicted your own line out of your own mouth. 9 generations, and they pruned their daughters off the slate like sucker growth, and not one speaker so much as wrote down that he had done it. That is what your people do with account when keeping it grows inconvenient. He straightened, addressing the whole harbor now, pitiless and carrying. And the compact shelf town is account. You have forgotten even that much. You think it was weather sold for mutton. Ask your speaker what it was. Ask him what his line was for. He does not know. The knowing fell off your slate with the daughters generations gone. And you ask my parliament to bind itself for 9 more generations to a people who cannot keep their own. That is the charge, Seska said quietly, into the ringing that followed. He has the right to lay it, speaker, and the parliament has voted it be answered, not waved away. When the candidate comes to the moot ledge, the answer comes with her, or there is no renewal, the dark of the moon. Be ready. Her eyes, ember orange, rested on Tamsin a moment, and there was something in them that was not unkind. The eldest asks that you not be long. She is holding on by choosing to. When the 2 of them had gone, the wall stood silent a long moment, and then everyone spoke at once, and in the middle of it, Cormac Vey looked down at his granddaughter, with the expression of a man reading a chart that has just told him the harbor is standing in does not exist. What the line was for, he repeated, half to himself. I held that stone every night of my life, girl. It says the compact in 2 tongues, weatherward for provision, faith for faith. There is nothing else on it. Then the something else, Tamsin said, was never on the stone. The days after that ran like a tide race, and Tamsin stood in the middle of them while the town rearranged itself around her, which it did with all the grace of cargo shifting in a gale. Some of it was ugly. She heard the girl provoke them in at least 3 mouths, and Brem said at the family table that entering her would shame Aaron's memory, at which her mother rose without one word and took the ash jar down off its shelf and set it in front of him and asked which winter of which speaker he would like to give back. And Brem found business down coast. Some of it was the opposite of ugly. Old Hesper, boatless, walked up to her at the chain in front of 40 people, took off his cap and asked her, the way you ask an official thing, whether the Count had room in it for boats. His smack had been his grandfather's. When it's mine to keep, Tamsin said, the Count will hold whatever kept this town alive. And the old man put his cap back on and nodded as if a paper had been signed. And that was the moment, she thought later, when Selkenshore as a body quietly changed what it believed a tally was for. Colm Brant came to the Vey house the third evening, stood in the doorway turning his cap in his hands, and formally in the old words withdrew as candidate. He did it before witnesses, to Cormac's face, which took more courage than the mid-steps had. You taught me the stages have an order, Speaker, he said. First among them, the lister chooses. It chose. A man who stands in front of someone else's answer because the form likes his shape better, that man would shame your line worse than any entering could. He stopped, ears going red, and added plainly, calm again. Besides, 8 nights up there, sir. Whatever's been keeping that gallery warm at dusk these years, it was never waiting on me. He left. The kitchen was very quiet. Cormac stood at the window a long time, looking up at the dark shoulder of the brows, and then he took the lamp and his coat and went out without a word, and Tamsin watched through the glass as the light of him went, slowly, with 3 rest stops for a 71-year-old heart, up the gull scramble of the east shoulder to the gull step, where the chalk was. He was gone above an hour. Her mother sat darning and said nothing, but her needle slowed and finally stopped, and the two of them sat listening to the fire and the wind and the absence of an old man, and Tamsin thought of what stood written up there in 500 marks of careful 5-bar chalk. 4 years of dusks. The cup with her father's fire in it. She had left the charred knuckle of driftwood in the chalk tin. The names down the rock where she had begun this last year, scratching the daughters with a nail, because chalk washed, and she had wanted at least one slate in the world they could not be wiped from. When he came back down, he stood in the kitchen doorway with the lamp, and the salt wind had been at his eyes, or something had, and he looked at his granddaughter for a long moment across the room her father had drummed the cadence in. Marin Vey, he said at last. His recitation voice 3 beats and a fall, but low, fitted to a kitchen. Who provisioned the steps through the famine winter while her brother lay fevered? I checked the rolls behind you, girl. 11 trips up in black ice. The tally gives that winter to Vey the 5th. He set the lamp on the table with the exaggerated care of a man whose hands wanted to shake. He was the brother. He was the one in the fever bed. We have been singing her deed under his name for 6 generations. He sat down slowly, like a tower agreeing at last with the sea. I am not a man who turns easily. You know it. The town knows it. It has kept this shelf alive once or twice, my not turning. So weigh what it weighs, what I am about to say. He looked up, and he had her father's eyes, or her father had had his, and for once the old man let her see all the way down into them, into 3 years of standing before a silent cliff with the wrong name surviving him. The slate was wrong before I held it. A form that loses true names is not a rope, it is a leak. Your father knew it. He was kinder than me, he just went around me quiet. 3 beats at a kitchen table. His voice cracked, 1 beat, and the fall came late, and he let it. I cannot give you what I refused you. It isn't mine now, the eldest saw to that. What is mine is the entering. Dawn on the wall before the whole shelf. I will speak the tally of the line of Vey, and this time, by God, it will balance. Tamsin Vey, who had not cried on the wall, nor on the shelf under the eye the size of a doorway, nor in 4 years of being looked past like a mooring post, sat down at her father's table across from her grandfather and cried until the lamp needed trimming, and the old man, who did not hold people, held her, and her mother let the darning lie and put her hand on both their heads as if banking a fire for the night. At dawn, the tide turning, Cormac Vey stood on the harbor wall where he had stood at the season's start, and Selkenshore packed the stones to hear him, boats standing in from the early sets with their crews up the rigging to sea. He spoke the tally as it had never in 9 generations been spoken, the 8 speakers name by name, deed by deed, and woven in among them, in the cadence, in their right places by birth and death, the daughters, with her famine winter given back to her at last, 50 fathoms of held breath along that wall when he did it. Edda, carrier of the cadence. Name after name off the netting rolls and the grave markers and the nail-scratched rock of the gull step, 6 and 20 restorations, the dark half of the count brought up into the light of a cold morning by the one voice in Selkenshore with the standing to do it. He spoke the witnesses of the living blood, Brem absent, Tad Ori, the babe in arms, and Tamsin Vey, he said, and stopped. And the stop was 3 beats long, a cadence rest, her father's rest, and every soul on the wall heard the old man choose his words with the whole of his life behind them. Daughter of Aaron, daughter of the line, who kept the count when the speaker would not, entered this day as candidate of the house of Vey, that the quickening be run true. Let the slate carry what the cliff already knows. The sound the town made then was not a cheer. Selkenshore was not a cheering town. It was a long exhale, 400 chests together, the sound a crew makes when the line comes off the winch and holds. And to the end of her life, Tamsin would take it over any cheer ever raised. Far up the cliff face, along the high gallery where the light never quite caught, something vast settled itself with a sound like a satisfied avalanche. The eldest had her answer to the first stage. There were 5 more, a dying dragon, a rust-black charge waiting at the dark of the moon, and a hole in the compact that no one alive could name. They had 11 days. The ash cup was given to her that same evening, and her grandfather did a thing at the hearth that no speaker had done in the whole life of the jar. He kept the vigil with her. That was not the form. The form said the candidate watched alone. The form has had its way with this family long enough to spare me one night of it, was all he said. And so the 2 of them sat up by the fire while the wind worked the shutters, and he talked. Not instruction, stories. Vey the Sixth, who had been afraid of the stair all his life and climbed it anyway, white-handed every quarter day. Cormac's own father, who had once spoken the tally through a burst lip after a boom swung wide, because the count does not stop for blood either. And Aaron. He talked about Aaron for the first time in 4 years, about a boy who had learned the cadence faster than any Vey in memory and then committed the one unforgivable act which was dying before his father, and somewhere in the middle of it the old man's voice stopped working, and Tamsin put more wood on the fire and let the silence be what it was. Some stages of a line's quickening she understood that night. Never get names. At dawn he took down the ash jar and made the cup, water, salt, the fingerprint of every speaker's hearth back to the first. Then he held out his hand, palm up. The tin, he said. She gave him the chalk tin from her pocket. He took out the charred knuckle of driftwood, her Caspat's midsummer fire, 4 years carried, and he crumbled a corner of it into the jar itself in among the 8 speakers, where it would be from now on, going forward, in every cup the line would ever drink. Entered, he said, husk-voiced, and then he added a fingerprint of it to her cup, and Tamsin Vey drank her line's whole history of keeping people alive, her father's fire in it, and it was foul, and her eyes stung, and this time she let them. The long listening stood already past, declared by the eldest's own mouth before the whole harbor. Even Vargoth had not tried to dispute it. That left the carrying, the question, the answer, the ceiling, and a dying dragon holding the door open by choosing to. Cormac mapped the 11 days like a passage through skerries. Mornings the stair. He could no longer climb past the mid-steps himself, but he climbed what he could and talked her up the rest. Every hold and shelf and treachery of Tekloon's stair laid out in his head like harbor soundings, because he had climbed it once a quarter for 50 years. Afternoons, the forms of the moot ledge, the addresses, the order of standing, what a candidate might say and must never say. Evenings she climbed to the gull step, and the eldest came down the cliff like a slow gray tide and lay along the gallery above her, and they talked, a girl and a creature out of the world's first mornings, while the light died over the skerries. Those evenings afterward Tamsin kept like coins. Ashvarn would not speak of the hole in the compact, not yet. Ask me on the ledge, with the Parliament's eyes on the asking. That is where the answer does its work. But she spoke of everything else. Of the making of the compact, Tekloon and Vey the First, a winter so bad the 2 peoples had eaten from the same dwindling pile and found they could not tell any more whose deaths diminished whom. Of what the shelf looked like to a creature for whom 9 human generations were the time between 2 moltings of the high lichen. Of dying, once briefly, in the flat practical way of the very old. I am not holding the door for your town. Small voice, she said. Towns come and go like weed rack, even good ones. I am holding it because I have watched a thing being forgotten for 300 years, and I find I cannot go into the wind until somebody has remembered it in front of witnesses. The dead have so few appetites. Indulge me. On the 6th evening, Tamsin brought her a question she had been turning over since the wall. Vargoth, she said. He hates us like weather, like it isn't even personal. The harpoon crew, the brood sister. Is that the whole of it? The eldest was quiet so long that the first stars came out. Her name was Skell, she said at last, and no small voice. The harpoon is not the wound. Harpoons we understand. Your kind kills the way storms kill, and we do not hate storms. I will tell you the wound. because you of every creature on this shelf will know it when you hear it." The great milky eye turned down to her. "When a dragon dies, who says their name afterward? Think before you answer. We have no jars, no slates, no netting rolls. Our memory lives where it has always lived, in the eldest head still warm. I hold the names of every parliament dead back to the compact and long before, every deed, every broodline, the way you hold your 8 speakers. And when I die, Tamsin Vey, there is no one entered behind me. The line of our remembering has run thin for centuries. The ones who should have carried it died of sickness and harpoon and high ice winters, faster than the count could be passed. Vargoth's skell lies in my keeping with all the rest. He has not heard her name spoken aloud by anyone in 106 years, because only I am old enough to have it, and he cannot bear to ask, because asking is how you admit a thing is nearly gone. The breath that rolled over the shelf was older than the town below it. Now ask yourself why a creature like that votes to let the compact lapse. It is not hate of you, small voice. It is arithmetic. He looks at a people who threw away their own daughters' names and concludes, reasonably, that such a people will never carry ours. Tamsin stood a long time in the dark with her back against the nail-scratched names of the Vey daughters, and the shape of the thing came over her slowly, like making out a headland through fog. What the compact had been, what the line had been for, what had fallen off the slate. "The boundary stones," she said suddenly, "on the headland. The first speaker's stones, with the grooves everyone calls plow-scratch. I used to copy the grooves with charcoal when I was small, just for the pattern of them. That's not plow-scratch, is it? Clim with your copies on the night," was all the eldest said, but the old amber eye held something that a 14-year-old could only call, however strange the word sat on a creature the size of a headland, hope. The 8th day the sky went wrong after noon and the sea with it, and every glass in Selkenshore fell like a dropped plum. And the fleet was out, the whole fleet, because the season's last big herring set had come up the coast and no town won storm depth from ruin leaves, herring in the water. Tamsin stood on the wall with her grandfather and watched the line of black come up over the skerries faster than boats run. And all around them the shore crews stood with the old helplessness settling over them like ash. No warning had come for 3 years. 22 boats, and her mother's blue hull among them, and the harbor mouth a needle's eye, and the black coming on. The crags moved. The whole town saw it. Off the highest gallery a shape detached itself, vast and gray and terribly slow, wings taking the storm front air with a labor that hurt to watch, and Ashvaran the eldest, who had perhaps a handful of flights left in her body and knew their number better than anyone, spent one of them. She beat out over the skerries into the teeth of the coming dark, swung one full circle over the scattered fleet, the old circle, the one out of every grandfather's stories, and her voice came down through the rising wind like a tide through a sea cave, in the human tongue, with the old cadence in it, 3 beats and a fall, Selkenshore. The wind turns, run home now. 22 boats cut their nets, every fathom of a season's best set, and ran, and the harbor took them in like a mother counting children, the blue taro hull 18th through the needle's eye, and the storm fell on an empty sea and screamed about it all night, and got nothing. Ashvaran did not return to the high gallery. She came down low and heavy to the broad shelf above the gull step, landed like an anchor going down, and did not rise again. From that night the whole town could see her from the harbor, a gray headland lying along the cliff where no headland had been, and Selkenshore understood the price of its fleet without anyone saying it aloud. The eldest had spent the strength she was holding the door with. The dark of the moon stood 3 days off. She would not see much past it. That evening the lamps came up the cliff. Tamsin watched them from the gull step, disbelieving. A line of bobbing lights up the gull scramble, half the town in their oilskins, carrying what a fishing town carries when it cannot say what it feels. Mutton, smoked herring by the basket. Old Hesper hauled up a brazier on his back, 70 years old, boatless, and set it burning at a respectful distance so the great dying shape would have a warm light to lie beside, the way you would sit with anyone. Nobody made a speech. They left what they brought and touched their caps to the candidate and went back down, and Ashvaran watched them go with her head on her foreclaws. 300 years, she said, to no one in particular, in something like wonder, and they remember the sitting with, who forgot everything else. The night before the dark of the moon, Cormac walked his granddaughter to the foot of Tecloon's stair as the light failed. The form gave the carrying to the candidate alone, from first stone to moot ledge, through the night, to stand before the Parliament at dawn. The mouthstone hung at her chest in its old leather sling, 50 years of one man's nightly polishing warm in it like banked heat. In her pack, wrapped in oilcloth against the spray, 4 years of chalk tin and a roll of childhood charcoal rubbings that might be plow-scratch and might be people's lost dead, and bread, and her mother's whole answer to the entire affair, a pair of sealskin mitts with the fingers restitched double, because Nesve said her piece with a needle. 1,100 steps to the mid-gallery, Cormac said. Then the broken 100, then the chimney with the iron rungs, the 7th and the 9th want resetting. Trust them with a hand but never with the whole of you. Then the high traverse, wind there always, even on a flat night. It will be coming on northwest by dawn. He stopped. None of it was anything he had not said 30 times. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her, 14 in oilskins, his son's level gray eyes looking back at him out of her mother's stubborn face, and the old man let the form go for one beat. I look past you on this wall in front of the whole shelf, he said. I will hear it told over my grave, and that is correct, it should be. Whatever the Parliament says at dawn, you have already done the thing this line was made for, and you did it alone, in the dark, for 4 years, with nobody's leave. He took her shoulders 3 beats in the fall. Clem speaker. She went up into the dark of Tekloon Stair, and the town stood below with every lamp on the harbor wall lit, watching the small light of her rise. The first 1,100 steps were almost kind. They were the old worked stair, cut by hands 9 generations gone, each step hollowed by speaker's boots into a shallow cradle that took her foot, like a habit, and she climbed in the lee of the cliff with her lantern hooded to a slit, and the cadence running in her head to pace her breathing. 3 steps and a rest beat. Her father had drummed it. The stair itself, it turned out, was built to it. She wondered how many 100 years a line had to climb before its stonework and its songs were the same thing in 2 materials, and then she stopped wondering about anything because the worked stair ended at the mid-gallery and the broken 100 began. Here the cliff had shed itself some winter generations back and taken the stair with it, and what remained was a slumped chaos of block and scree, sloped wrong, freshly greased by the storm 2 days gone. Her grandfather's soundings ran out here too. The broken 100 re-broke itself every few winters, he had warned her, and no map of it survived its own next frost. She went up it on all fours, lantern in her teeth, testing every block before she trusted it, and twice the night under her shifted with a grinding shrug, and she lay flat and breathed in the smell of wet stone until things chose to hold. Her knee found an edge somewhere in the dark and opened along it. She noticed it the way you notice weather, filed it among things that could be felt later, and climbed. The chimney with the iron rungs nearly ended everything, not at the 7th rung or the 9th, which she gave a hand and no more exactly as told, but at the top where the chimney flared and the rusted final rung came away in her grip whole like a rotten tooth, and for one entire heartbeat Tamsin Vey hung from her other hand over 400 feet of dark, with a dead piece of iron in her fist, and her whole line's history reduced to the friction of one sealskin mitt double-stitched on cold stone her mother's needle held. She got an elbow over the lip, then a knee, the cut one, which had opinions, and she lay on the flat shelf at the chimney head and let herself shake for the count of 20, and no longer. Below her the harbor lamps had shrunk to a brooch of light pinned on black water. Above her, one turn of the high traverse away, the sky was graying toward the worst dawn, or the best one the shelf had known in 9 generations. She drank, redid the sling of the mouthstone, and went up into the wind. The high traverse was a ledge the width of a gangplank, slung along the very brow of the crags with the whole northwest sky leaning on it, and Vargoth was waiting at the middle of it. He lay along a buttress above the path, with his wings half loosed into the wind, rust black against the graying east, and he let her come all the way to within 10 feet of him before he spoke. There was nowhere to go around. That was, she understood at once, the entire point. No Parliament sent me, he said. The keel on shingle voice was almost gentle, and that was worse. There is no stage on this stair that bids me be here, and no law against it either. I am merely an old creature lying on his own cliff at dawn. And you are a tired child 1,000 feet up, with the hard part behind you and one easy turn ahead, and I am going to give you the only honest gift you will get on this mountain. Turn back. Tamsin stood with the wind shoving at her like a crowd and said nothing. Her grandfather's forms had covered the moot ledge. They had not covered this. Not threat, Vargoth said. Prophecy. You will pass, small voice. The eldest has half the Parliament weeping into the wind already. My charge will be answered with whatever clever thing you are carrying in that pack, and the compact will be remade, and there will be warm seasons, a generation of them, perhaps 2. You will be a tale they tell, and then you will die, as your kind does in an eye blink, and your slate will pass to hands that did not climb this stair, and there will come a lean winter or a cheap one, and some speaker will find part of the count inconvenient. They always do. I have watched 9 generations of your line across this water, child. I watched them sing one daughter's famine winter under her brother's name, until even the stones believed it. Your people do not break faith like storms, all at once, honestly. You break it like rot, one convenient silence at a time, and you call the rot tradition, and you teach it the cadence. so I will not stand on my parliament floor and vote my dead into your keeping. Hers least of all. The wind keened along the traverse between them. Go home. Let the compact die clean while it still means something, and your town will scatter down the coast and live, and the wind will have the ledges, and nothing further will be lost. That is the kindest ending this cliff has on offer, and I am the only one who will tell you so. And the terrible thing, Tamsin thought, the thing she would never say on any wall, was that it was an honest argument, honestly made by a creature who had earned it. She was 14 and bleeding through one knee of her oilskins, and she stood on a gangplank of rock in half a gale and gave the Parliament's oldest grief the only thing she had, which was the truth. You're right, she said. The rust-black head, which had been settling toward dismissal, stopped. Everything you said about my line is true. We sang Marin's Winter under her brother's name for 6 generations. I can't promise you a speaker 100 years from now won't find some name. Inconvenient. Nobody alive can promise you that, and everyone who tries to is selling something. So here's what I can do. The wind tried to take her words, and she pitched them through it. 3 beats in a fall, the carrying cadence, and it carried. I can tell you that rot has a cure, and the cure is exactly what I did on that shelf for 4 years. Somebody outside the form, keeping the count anyway. Somebody the slate doesn't flatter, checking the slate. You, Vargoth. You've watched 9 generations of my line across this water, you just said so. You knew Marin's Winter was sung wrong. You knew it for 6 generations, and where were you? Lying on a cliff being right in private. That's rot too. We dropped our daughters' names. You sat on the truth of it a century and called the sitting wisdom. Same silence. Ours was convenient, yours was proud. She unslung her pack, there on the traverse, with the drop pulling at every loose thing, and took out the oilcloth roll and held it up so the gray light caught the charcoal sheets. I don't know what these say. I copied them off the first speaker's boundary stones when I was 9 because I liked the patterns. The eldest told me to climb with them, but I'll wager you the whole compact you can read them, and I'll wager you something else. There's a name in here you haven't heard another voice say in 106 years. So choose, old creature. Lie on your cliff and be right while the last keeping of her goes into the wind with the eldest. Or get off my path, walk onto that parliament floor, and check my slate for the next 9 generations. That's the job, Vargoth. That was always the job. It isn't trust either of us is short of. It's witnesses. The light came up over the skerries while the old dragon looked at her, and what moved behind the dark of his eyes she could not read and never afterward claimed to. He uncoiled from the buttress, and for one bad heartbeat the whole sky was rust-black wing, and then the path lay open, and Vargoth of the high winter ledges said, in a voice with a crack down the middle of it like sea ice in spring, her name was Skell. I know, Tamsin said, going past him, not breaking stride, because if she broke stride she was going to come apart. Number 41 on the 3rd stone. The eldest's going to teach me how to say it properly. Come and check my cadence. The moot ledge at dawn was the world's roof. A shelf of pale stone the size of the harbor square swept bald by 10,000 years of wind, and on it, ranked along the rising rim like a council of headlands, the crag parliament entire, 31 dragons of the high ledges, gray and slate and storm blue and bone, the least of them the size of the lifeboat shed, sitting motionless in the streaming gold of the new sun. Seska stood at the rim's gap as warden of the stage, and at the center, lying where she had been carried by 6 of the young in the night, the gray of her gone in 11 days from weathered slate to ash. The eldest of all of them lifted her head from the stone and watched a human child walk out of Tekloon's stair onto the parliament floor for the first time in 3 years. Bloodied, wind-flayed, 4'11" in her boots, with the mouthstone on her chest, swinging its little warm weight, 50 years of one stubborn old man's polishing facing 31 judges, rising light. Tamsin walked to the worn hollow at the floor's center where 9 generations of speakers had stood, set her feet in it, and found it fit. The candidate has carried the stone, Seska said formally, and her voice rolled around the rim. The 4th stage is past. Who speaks against the 5th? I laid a charge on this floor, Vargoth said, coming in over the rim behind her like a piece of the night, refusing to leave. The parliament stirred. Whatever they had expected of him, it was not the way he settled onto the stone at the rim's gap, deliberately, in the witness place. It stands. Let her answer it with the question. I will be listening to the count, a beat, keel on shingle, closely. The eldest's milky amber eye found Tamsin's, ancient and failing and lit, despite everything, with the dry private warmth of their evenings on the gull step, and the tide cave voice filled the world's roof one more time. Then ask, small voice, the 5th stage is yours. Ask your parliament's question, and we will all of us see what your line remembered. Her grandfather had drilled her on this stage harder than any other, because it was the one that had broken candidates of the line before. The first question was not a riddle, he said. It was a sounding. The Parliament did not judge the asking by cleverness. They judged what the question revealed about where the asker thought the weight of the world sat. They the Fourth had asked, on this floor, how long the compact's terms would hold, and been made to wait a year for re-asking, because the question of a clerk is not the question of a speaker. Ask the thing under the thing, Cormac had said, and whatever you do, do not ask for anything. Tamsin stood in the worn hollow with the sun coming up the world's rim, and she did not ask for the compact. She did not ask for the weather word, or for the town, or for time. She turned from the eldest and looked along the whole rank Parliament, the gray and the slate and the storm blue and the bone, the headlands with eyes, and she asked the question she had been carrying up 1,100 steps, and a broken hundred and a chimney and a gangplank of wind, the one that had been assembling itself in her since a dusk on the gull step when a dying creature said the dead have so few appetites. When the eldest goes into the wind, Tamsin said, who says your names? The Parliament did not move, and the not moving was the loudest thing she had ever stood inside. Your memory lives in the eldest head still warm, she told me. Every Parliament dead back past the compact, every brood line, every deed, all of it in one keeping, and nothing entered behind her. So that's my question, Parliament of the Crags. Not what becomes of my town when she dies. What becomes of your dead? Who gets Skell after the dark of this moon? Who gets Teclun? She let the wind have the floor for 3 beats, the cadence rest, and then she gave them the fall. Because I think you've been watching one count rot on this shelf for 300 years, and grieving another one, and I think the thing my line forgot is that those were never 2 counts. I think that's what the compact was. Speaker's blood, said a storm blue dragon at the rim, low, to no one, and the words ran along the ranked heads like wind through a barley field, and the eldest closed her eyes and let it run. It was Seska who answered formally as warden. The candidate asks the Parliament to show its wound. By what right? By this one. Tamsin knelt on the bald stone, opened the oilcloth roll, and spread the charcoal sheets where the light could take them, weighting the corners with chalk tin and water flask and her mother's mitts. 9 sheets, a child's careful rubbings of grooves in headland granite that every plowman in Selkenshore had walked past for 9 generations. The boundary stones of Ve the First. We thought the marks were plow scratch. We thought, when we thought anything, that the first speaker had set blank stones to mark the line's ground. The eldest told me to climb with these, and she doesn't spend her breath idly, so before all of you, I'm asking her to spend a little more. She looked up at the ash-gray head, the failing amber eye. Read them, Ashvaron rose. It took her a long time, and no dragon on that floor made a sound while it took, and when she stood at last over the spreadsheets, swaying slightly, the rising sun lit her like a sail going to rags, and she looked down at a child's charcoal for the space of 10 waves below. Oh, small voice, she said at last, and her voice had changed. The tide had come all the way into the cave. Oh, you bright, stubborn, unentered thing, do you know what you carried up my stair? Tell them, the second tally. The words went out over the Parliament and struck like the first drops of weather everyone has watched coming for an hour. The grave count of the Crag Parliament, cut in human stone by the hand of Ve the First in the first winter of the compact. Here is Murrath Cloud Counter, who died of the black lung ice the year of the making. Here is Tef of the low ledges. Here is Olivar Saskor. Then of the 9 broods, the names of our dead as we gave them, 300 years ago, to the only creatures on this world who make memory out of stone instead of out of skulls. The great ruined wing swept slowly over the 9 sheets, not touching. This was the bargain under the bargain. Weatherward for provision, yes, mutton and herring, the clerk's layer, the layer that survived on their slate because clerks always survive. But the making of it, the thing Teclun and the first swore on this floor, was this. Each people keeps the others dead. They cut our names where frost cannot reach. We hold their names where forgetting cannot, in the long heads, down the long years, 2 tallies crossed like hands, because Teclun had watched the humans bury a child that first winter, and write on the stone, and he said, here at last is a creature that grieves in a material that outlives grief, and we are creatures whose grief outlives every material. We were made to keep each other. The eye came up and found Vargoth at the rim and held him. It was never trade, old friend. It was never even peace. It was 2 kinds of remembering lashed together against the dark, and both our peoples let the lashing rot, and called the rot by gentler names, and I am the last knot of it, and I am going into the wind at this moon's dark. And a fortnight ago I believed it all went with me. And then, Seska said quietly, into the enormous hush, a child on a shelf began saying left-out names in the old cadence. Every dusk, the eldest said, for 4 years. Names her own slate refused. No one taught her the bargain under the bargain. She reinvented it alone in chalk, out of nothing but grief and stubbornness, because it is not a clause, Parliament. It was never a clause. It is the thing her kind and our kind have in common at the bottom of everything, and the compact was only ever its harness. She turned, and the whole weight of her regard came down on the girl standing in the worn hollow. The fifth stage asked what her line remembered. You have your answer. The line remembered nothing. The girl remembered everything. Without being told, which is the only kind of remembering I would stake my debt on, I am satisfied. Let it be tried. That was Vargoth, and the whole floor turned. He had not moved from the witness place, but he was standing now, rust-black in the gold light, and his dry, grinding voice held something Tamsin had not heard in it before, which was effort. Pretty all of it. The crossed hands, the harness, the child with the chalk. I watched her climb. Parliament, I will say so when it is voted, she passes whatever I have standing to judge. But sentiment is not keeping. The first speaker cut 9 stones, and his line forgot the stones existed. The proof of account is not the cutting. It is the saying, down the years, after the cutter is dead. So I asked the stage that the law gives me. He came forward onto the floor, and dragon by dragon, the Parliament drew breath. The sixth stage is the answer borne down. The candidate carries our word to her town, whole, unsoftened, however it lands. Then let our word be this, and let it be the trial and the terms in one. The eldest holds the names of the Parliament's dead, 300 years of them, the ones behind these 9 stones, the ones no granite ever got. She has 1 night left in her strong enough for the giving. I have watched her breathe. Do not any of you pretend otherwise so. Tonight she gives the second tally to the candidate, all of it, in the old cadence. At dawn the child says it back, on this floor, whole, before witnesses. If she fails honestly, and the compact dies clean, and I will mourn it, which is a sentence I did not expect to say. But if she holds it, if a human child stands where you are all standing and gives our dead back to us with no stone to read from, then I will stand surety for the rest myself. I will go down to their wall every equinox for the length of my life and hear the count said, and check it, name by name, and the first convenient silence I find, the compact ends. That is my price, Parliament. A witness with no reason to be kind. Vote. You'd come down to the wall, Tamsin said. It came out before form or sense could stop it. Every equinox. Yourself. The rust-black head swung to her, and for a moment, one moment, on the world's roof, in front of 30 headlands and the dying sunlit eldest, something moved through the old dragon's eye that on any other creature she would have called shyness. Someone checked your slate once a century. Small voice, Vargoth said. Look what grew. The Parliament voted the way dragons vote, which is with silence. Objection is spoken aloud, and none was. Seska sealed the stage. The terms went down to Selkenshore that noon by envoy, so the town would know to gather at the second dawn, and Tamsin Vey ate bread and mutton on the moot ledge floor with her back against the warm flank of the eldest of the crag Parliament, and slept 3 hours in the lee of her wing like a gull chick under a roof of grey sails, and was woken at dusk by the oldest voice in the world saying, with something that was almost laughter under the tiredness, wake, speaker's blood. School is the whole night long, and my dead are particular about their cadence. No human being had ever heard what Tamsin Vey heard that night, and none ever would again, because what passed from the eldest to the candidate on the moot ledge between dusk and dawn was the whole held grief of a species given once by the last head warm enough to hold it. It did not work the way she had feared. She had imagined a list, an avalanche of strange syllables to be caught and stacked, and had lain awake on the stone that afternoon coldly certain that no head her size could take 300 years in a night. But the dragon way of remembering was not a list, and the moment Ashvaran began, Tamsin understood why the cadence existed at all, why 3 beats and a fall had come down 9 generations of her own line like a heartbeat, why her father's 2 fingers on a kitchen table had been able to put the whole count into a 5-year-old. The cadence was not decoration. It was architecture. Each name came inside a little house of rhythm with its deed for a roof and its broodline for a doorway, and each house leaned on the last and held up the next so that the tally was not 300 items but one long unbroken thing. The way a net is one thing, and you did not memorize it. You learned to walk through it, and the walking taught your feet. Murith Cloud Counter, the eldest said, and the wind off the dark sea took the old syllables, and Tamsin took them after it, again, until the house stood. Murith, who had numbered the autumn fronts for the fishing of a people not yet her people, dead of the black lung ice the year of the making. Tef of the low ledges, who had loved the taste of human chimney smoke and been teased for it a century. Olivar, who broke his wing on the night of the great gale and walked up the whole of the coast range, to bring the warning his wing could not carry, and died of the walking and was given for it the longest deedline in the count. Saskor, Ven of the 9 broods. Name on name, house on house, the Parliament's dead came across the dark gap between the species and took up residence in a 14-year-old from Selkenshore, And somewhere in the deep of the night, Tamsin stopped being able to tell whether she was learning the count or the count was learning her, and the moon's last sliver went down, and the eldest's voice grew slower and gentler, and they came, at the place where the night turns toward morning, to the name both of them had been climbing toward. Skell, said Ashvaran, and the house this name lived in had a different weather inside it. Brood sister of Vargoth of the high winter ledges. Sister of the same wind, we say. They cracked from one clutch in one storm, and never after flew, but the other knew the line of it. She it was who argued the young dragons into keeping the compact the year the sickness took a third of the parliament, and grief made them bitter. She stood on this floor on the stone you are sitting on, small voice, and said, "The humans bury their dead facing the water, so the dead can watch the boats come home. A people who do that will keep our names when our own heads go cold. Bind to them." 109 years she kept the high traverse clear of ice falls with her own wings before the harpoon crew out of the southern ports, who had never heard of any compact, took her in the open water for the bounty her ridge plates fetched. The old voice did not waver. It had carried this too long to waver. Vargoth brought back her plates and her name. The plates lie under the buttress on the traverse where he made you stand and argue for your life, which you should know now was not cruelty. It was the only altar he has. And the name came to me because the holding of names is the eldest, and he has been 106 years too proud and too broken to ask me to say it to him, and I have been 106 years too much a coward to offer. Of all my dead small voice, this is the one I am gladdest to be giving you, and the one you must say most perfectly, because at dawn, when you say it, you will be saying it to him. Tamsin took the house of Skell into the count and walked through it until her feet knew every stone of it. And out on the black rim of the moot ledge, all that night, a rust-black shape lay with its head turned to the sea, ostentatiously not listening, in the manner of old creatures everywhere keeping vigil over the thing they cannot ask for. In the deepest part of the night, the part the fishers call the dead water, the count nearly broke her. It was not any single name. It was the weight of all of them together, 200 houses and more standing in a head that had been awake since the foot of the stair, and somewhere in the long middle reaches, in a run of brood lines from the sickness years, she felt the architecture begin to lean. She walked back through it to check a doorway and found the doorway dark. She went back further, and a house she had built an hour before stood with its roof gone. The deed line vanished clean out of her. And the cold that went through Tamsin Bay then was worse than the chimney, worse than the traverse, because iron and wind only kill you, and this would kill the whole point of her. She stopped. She heard her own breathing go ragged in the dark, and the enormous patient presence behind her said nothing at all, offering nothing, because this stage had no help in it, and both of them knew it. 3 beats, her father said, from 4 years under a cairn and 5 years back of that, 2 fingers on a kitchen table, and the fall. You don't carry the count, Tam, you walk it. When you lose a room, you don't stand in the dark grabbing. You go back at the last lit door and you walk forward again at the pace the rhythm gives you, because the cadence remembers more than you do. That is what it's for. That is what it was always for. She went back to the last lit door. The cadence took her like a tide takes a hull off a bar, and the dark house stood up again with its roof on. Selachor of the sickness years, who carried her own dead brood to the high ice singing, and Tamsin said the deed line into the night and felt it set like a cut stone. And behind her the eldest let out a long, slow breath that was not relief, because the eldest of the Crag Parliament did not show relief, but that moved the chalk dust all the same in little ghosts. Every keeper meets that hour, Ashvaran said quietly, when the run was solid and they rested. The hour the count is suddenly heavier than the head. I met it on this ledge 300 years ago, with my own teacher dying behind me at quarter the pace yours is. You will meet it again, on some night when you are old and a young keeper is sitting where you sit. Tell them what your father told you. It has had other words in other mouths, but it is the oldest sentence either of our people's owns. Walk, don't carry. The great ruined head turned toward the rim of the world, where the black had gone the color of deep iron. Now stand up, small voice. Dead water's past. The tide of you is coming back in. I can hear it, and we have 40 houses yet. And I find, with the dry warmth coming up through the tiredness like an ember through ash, that I am spending my last night exactly as I would have chosen, which is a thing almost no one gets, and I will not have it shortened. Murith's line again from the top. You drag the 3rd beat when you tire. The dead notice. Once near the end of the night, Tamsin walked to the rim to drive the blood back into her legs and looked down and stood very still. The harbor wall of Selkenshore was lit end to end, not the watch lamps, every lamp, hundreds of them, a thin necklace of fire laid along the black water 1,000 feet below, and at the foot of the speaking steps, where the worked stair began, one lamp stood apart from the rest, hooded to a slit, exactly at the place where the form said a speaker waits when the form gives him nothing else to do. He could not hear the count from there. He could not see her. He had 3 years of silence in his knees and 71 winters on his back, and he stood at the bottom of 1,100 steps all the same, holding a light she could only just make out, because his granddaughter was on the mountain and the line of Vey does not go to bed while its speaker is working. They keep the sitting with, said the eldest behind her, who missed nothing, even dying, 300 years, and that they kept. Come away from the edge, keeper, 40 houses. Walk. Dawn came up the color of new rope. The parliament assembled in silence. Below, impossibly far below, the harbor wall of Selkenshore stood black with the whole town. Come out in the half-dark to stare up at the crags, because the envoy's terms had told them when, if not what. Cormac Vey stood at the chain with the slate against his chest like a breastplate, and on the world's roof, in the worn hollow where her feet now fit, Tamsin Vey stood up in front of 31 headlands with eyes, and the eldest lying spent and ash-gray behind her, and Vargoth in the witness place with the light coming up his rust-black flank like a slow tide, and she began. She did not falter at mirth. 3 beats and a fall. She did not falter at teff of the chimney smoke, and a sound went down the ranked parliament like wind finding an old door, because the deed lines were coming out whole in the old syllables in a human child's voice pitched to carry, and they had none of them, not the youngest, ever heard their dead in any voice but the eldest's. She walked the count. Olivar's long deed line, the broken wing, the walking. Somewhere in it she heard, without breaking stride, a dragon weeping, which sounds like rain beginning far off. House on house, name on name, the night's whole architecture stood up in the morning light and bore weight, and the sun cleared the skerries, and Tamsin Vey came down the long count to the place where the weather changed, and turned in the worn hollow to face the rim. Skell, she said, 3 beats. The fall, sister of the same wind of Vargoth of the high winter ledges. The deed line, whole, the floor of this parliament, the year of the bitter sickness, they bury their dead facing the water, bind to them. 109 years of the high traverse swept clear, the open water, the southern cruise who never knew. She said it the way the eldest had given it to her, perfectly. And then, because she was her mother's daughter as well as her lines, she gave it one thing more that no one had taught her, and stepped out of the hollow, and walked across the bald stone to the witness place, and stood directly under the old dragon's lowered head, close enough to feel the furnace of his breath, alone, the way he had made her stand on the traverse. Skell, Tamsin said again up into the dark of his eye, quietly for the witness place only, the way you say a name to family. She'd have liked that you're going to check the slate. There are sounds that have no business coming out of creatures the size of wrecked ships. The parliament looked away, all of them, 31 heads turning gravely to study the sea, the sky, the fascinating stone, in the oldest courtesy there is, while Vargoth of the high winter ledges bowed his head over a human child until his brow ridge nearly touched her. Hair and shook once and mastered it, and said in a dry, grinding, carrying voice that did not entirely hold, "The count is true, I have listened. Parliament, name by name, as was my charge. Nothing dropped, nothing softened. The candidate holds the second tally entire, and I stand surety, as I priced it every equinox for my life's length. A beat. Vote." Silence, which is how dragons vote. Not one objection rose. And the sun stood clear of the sea, and Seska the warden said formally, into the hush, "The parliament is bound. Eldest, the 7th stage is yours, while you have breath for it." What Tamsin remembered afterward of the ceiling was not the form of it, though the form was kept. It was the smallness of the distance at the end between the two of them after all the vastness. Ashvaron did not rise. She could not. The candidate came to her instead, was beckoned in under the shadow of the ash-gray head, into the warmth that was already, perceptibly, hour by hour, banking itself down like a hearth at night's end, and the milky amber eye, very close, held her the way it had held her the first evening on the gull step, with that dry, ancient, particular warmth that the whole parliament knew and no human but one had ever been shown. 9 generations of your line stood where you are standing, the eldest said, for the ledge entire, though her voice was going soft at its edges like worked wax, and I gave each of them their speaking name, and the names were good names. Keeper, carrier, voice of the shelf. Yours is not those. Hear the last name I will ever give. The breath came slow, 3 beats, and the fall, Atave, in the old tongue of my dead who live in you now, she who counts what others drop. Speaker the 9th of the line of Vey, first keeper of the 2 tallies, entered this day in the only slate my kind possesses, which is the long warm head where no convenient silence reaches. Go down, Atave. Your town is on the wall, and the 6th stage is the carrying down of answers, and oh, small voice, what answers you carry. Stay, Tamsin said. It broke every form on the mountain, and she said it anyway, with her fist against the great jaw, 14 years old at the end of all her strength. Stay for the equinox. Hear it said once at the wall. Even eldest do not get every name they want said in their hearing, Ashvaran said, and the laugh under it was the tide going out of the cave, gentle final. That is what keepers are for. I held the door, small voice. You are through it. The rest is yours and his and theirs, and mine is the wind's. The eye drew her in one last time, immense, failing, satisfied. I was at the making of the compact, and I am at the remaking. And between those two mornings, I have outlived everything I loved except remembering itself. You gave my dead back to me while I could still hear them in a living voice that was not my own. Whatever your slate says, whatever mine, that is the deed line I am taking into the wind. Now stand clear, keeper. Going is a thing my kind does flying. What Selkenshore saw from the black-packed harbor wall in the full gold of morning was this. The eldest of the crag parliament rising off the moot ledge for the last time, slow, enormous, ragged-sailed, with the entire parliament lifting around and beneath her like a tide bearing a ship off a bar, 31 dragons holding the morning air in ranked silence while the ash-gray shape climbed past them, higher than the crags, higher than the weather, out over the open sea beyond the skerries where the deep water turns from green to iron, and there, at the top of the morning she turned once, a full slow circle, the old circle, the stormward circle, over the boats and the wall and the steps and the small stubborn town that had sat with her dying and remembered the sitting, with 300 years after forgetting everything else. And then she set her wings like a gull setting for the long glide, and went down the wind, and did not come back, and the Parliament's voices rose behind her in a sound the shelf had never heard. 31 throats keeping one note which Tamsin alone, of every human soul staring upward, knew was not grief, it was a count, beginning. The first house of a new tally, the name in it was Ashvaran. She came down Tekloon's stair through the middle of the day, and she did not come down alone. Seska flew Warden's escort, a slow gray shadow keeping pace down the cliff, and when Tamsin's boots found the last worked step and the harbor square opened before her, the whole of Selkenshore stood waiting in a silence you could have walked on. The sixth stage was the answer borne down, and the form was exact. The candidate speaks the Parliament's word to the town whole, unsoftened, however it lands, before rest, before food, before family. Her mother stood at the front of the crowd with her hands wrapped in her apron to keep them still. Her grandfather stood beside the chain with the slate, and when he saw her state, the open knee, the wind-burned face, the way she planted her feet, something went over his features that he would have denied under oath, and he straightened his back as if rank were being piped aboard. Tamsin walked to the worn place on the wall, where the tally had been spoken for 9 generations, faced the town, and gave them all of it, in the carrying cadence exactly as it had been given to her. The compact stood renewed, she told them, from the dark of this moon for so long as both tallies were kept. The weather word would come down as it came down in the grandfather's time, and the ledges would be provisioned as in the grandfather's time. But let no one in Selkenshore ever again call that the compact, for that was only the compact's clerk work. The compact was this: each people keeps the others dead. The Parliament would hold the line of Vey and every name the line carried in the long warm heads where no winter reaches. And Selkenshore would hold the Parliament's dead in stone and in voice, the second tally, 300 years of it, beginning again from where it had rotted off the slate. And the equinox accounting would say both counts at this wall, whole, every year, forever, and the first dropped name ended everything. And there will be a witness, she said, and pointed up, to the rust-black shape lying along the lowest gallery in full view of the harbor. The first time in living memory a dragon of the Parliament had taken a day perch below the crags, Vargoth of the high winter ledges. He'll come down to this wall every equinox for the length of his life and check our count, name by name. He doesn't trust us. That's the point of him. We dropped our own daughters off our own slate, so we don't get trusted, we get checked, and our grandchildren get checked, until checking is the tradition. If anybody minds being doubted by a dragon, mend it the only way it mends. Keep the count true so long that the doubt dies of boredom. A crowd takes a wedding in noise and a funeral in silence. And what Selkenshore had been handed was somehow both. And so it did what fishing towns do at the limit of feeling. It went quiet, and then somebody, later identified by 7 witnesses as old Hesper, said, "Well then," in a voice like a dropped anchor, and the town breathed again. The form gave her one last thing to do before the stage closed. She turned to her grandfather, as the line-standing speaker, to make the formal surrender of the answer, candidate to speaker. The word said 9 generations of times, the word is carried. Let speaker keep it. And Cormac Vey, who had stood 3 years before a silent cliff, who had looked past his own granddaughter on this wall in front of the whole shelf, because the form had made him and he had let it, did the last unprecedented thing of that unprecedented season. He did not receive the surrender. He stepped forward, took the slate from under his arm, the slate of the line of Vey, 50 years in his keeping, his son's before it was his, and he put it into her torn hands in front of the town, and the warden and the witness on the gallery. And he spoke his own surrender instead. In the cadence, 3 beats and a fall, his voice carrying to the last rank the way it had carried at the season's start. The word is carried. Let the speaker keep it. And then, alone of every form spoken on that shore in 9 generations in words of his own making, Tamsin Vey, Adavey, keeper of the 2 tallies, speaker the 9th of this line, the count was hers before any of us said so. The slate is only catching up. That night the Vey kitchen held 3 people in a slate, and nothing in the room was where it had been a season before, and everything was. Ness Vey put food in front of her daughter and stood over her until it was eaten, speaker the 9th, or no speaker the 9th, and then she took the torn knee of the oilskins away to mend, and paused in the doorway with the cloth over her arm. Your father used to sit there, she said to the room rather than to anyone, and drum that table until I threatened him with the kettle. I used to think it was a habit. She smoothed the oilcloth once. 15 years in this house, and I find out I was sleeping next to a man keeping a count nobody would let him say, out loud. She looked at Tamsin then, and her face did the thing it did in heavy weather, which was become completely calm. He'd be past all use tonight. He'd be up that cliff bawling like a seal. Eat the rest of that. Cormac sat across the table with the ash jar in front of him, and after a while he took the slate Tamsin had laid between them and turned it over in his big cracked hands and did not give it back. There is a thing I want done with this, he said. The form says the slate passes whole. The form has been wrong before. He set it down. The slate names 8 speakers and now their daughters, and that is the line mended backward. But your count is bigger than the line now, girl. 300 years of theirs in your head, and a town's worth of ours that no tally ever touched. Hesper's boat. Every keel and every name that kept this shelf alive. You said it to the old man at the chain the day after the envoy came. I had it from 4 mouths before sundown. When it's mine to keep, the count will hold whatever kept this town alive. He pushed the slate across the table to her, and his voice went to the cadence without his noticing, which was how you knew the deep water in him was moving. So keep it, all of it. The speakers and the daughters and the boats and the dragons, 1 count, 2 tallies, and let the slate be the smallest part of it. That's my instruction to my speaker, the only one I'll ever give her, and then I'm done instructing forever, and I'll mind the jar and grow old disgracefully. You'll stand witness at the wall, Tamsin said. Every accounting. I already told Seska. The old man looked at her a long moment, and the crack that had opened in him on the day of the long listening went all the way through at last, quietly, the way ice goes off a roof in the first thaw, and he said, I keeper, and got up and tended the fire so that his back could be to the room a while. And that was the whole of it. And it was enough, and her mother in the doorway watched the 2 of them with the mending forgotten over her arm. The first weather word of the renewed compact came down 9 days later, and Selkenshore would tell the story of it for a generation, not because anything went wrong, but because nothing did. It came at mid-morning on a day as innocent-looking as an empty hook, the glass steady, the sky a pale, clean lie, the fleet spread wide over the autumn grounds. Seska lifted off the middle gallery, swung the old circle over the harbor, and called the turn in the carrying voice. Wind behind the innocents, affront the glass would not feel for hours yet, run home by noon. And the fleet came in, unhurried, whole, nets stowed proper, and the men were eating bread on their own decks when the sea behind them went to, smoking white, and the whole town stood on the wall in the spray and watched the storm beat itself against an empty harbor mouth like a creditor, finding the house sold. Old Hesper stood next to Tamsin at the chain through the worst of it with his cap jammed down and his face unreadable, watching weather that, 1 season ago, would have cost the shelf boats and the men in them. 3 years we buried for want of that circle, he said at last, not bitterly, just entering it in his own ledger the way the old enter things. Then he turned his head and gave the speaker of the line of Vey the longest speech anyone had ever heard out of him. Your grandfather's a granite-headed old fool, and I've told him so across 60 years of slipways, and there's no man on this coast I'd sooner have minding a form, and you're the other thing. The thing that minds what the form's for. Town needs the both. Always did. Took a dying dragon to make it say so out loud, which is about the measure of this town. He resettled his cap. There's keel timber coming on the morning tide, Parliament hauled, and I mean to build on it till it's a boat. When she swims, she'll want a name on her bow. Marin, Tamsin said before he had finished turning to go, if you'll have it, famine winter. 11 trips up the steps in black ice, and her name sung under her brothers for 6 generations. The old man considered it with the gravity of his trade, nodded once as over a signed paper, and went down the wall to bully his cutting crews. And that spring, when the new smack went off the slip, with her paint still tacky and her bowboard reading Marin Vey in letters cut by the same, chisels that were putting the second tally into the harbor wall. Every soul in Selkenshore turned out to watch a famine winter come back from under a man's name and go fishing. The equinox came in with one of those high, rinsed mornings the shelf gets as apology for its winters, and Selkenshore held the first full accounting of the renewed compact, and it was nothing like the morning that had begun the season, and it was the same morning healed, and everyone on the wall knew both of those things at once. The town had spent the weeks between like a town possessed. The second tally was going back into granite, a long course of new-cut stone set into the harbor wall itself, where every boat warping in would pass it, and the cutting had been claimed fiercely as an honor the way pew seats are claimed elsewhere. Old Hesper, boatless no longer, since the Parliament's first act under the renewed compact had been 6 young dragons setting a replacement keel log on the slip like a cat presenting a kill, had taken charge of the cutting crews and ruled them with a boat builder's tyranny. A dropped chisel stroke in a dragon's name, he told them, was a dropped name waiting to happen, and not on his wall. Children who a season ago had played at being boat captains now played at being keepers, chalking tallies on every flat surface in town, and were not discouraged, and the netting house rolls had been rebound in oiled leather, and a daughter's birth wrote the same size as a son's. Colmbrant worked the cutting crews like a man paying off a debt nobody had charged him, and when Tamsin told him as much, he grinned and said the stages had an order, and his stage was evidently granite, and went back to it. He would stand harbor master himself someday, and a good one. The shelf would need its clerks, too. It always had. The sin had never been clerk work, only calling it the whole of the thing. At the turning of the tide, the accounting began. Vargoth came down to the wall as the terms had priced it, rust-black and vast and punctual, and took a perch on the wall's end like a figurehead of judgment, and the whole town packed the stones, and Tamsin Vey, Speaker the Ninth, stood in the worn place with the slate under her arm and her grandfather at her right shoulder in the witness place, where she had asked him to stand for as long as he had legs to stand it. She spoke the tally of the line of Vey, whole, 8 speakers, name by name, deed by deed, and woven among them in their right places the 26 daughters, Marin with her famine winter, Edda with her cadence, every recovered name wrung off the cliff in the morning sun. She spoke the living blood, Brem, returned from downcoast for it, chastened and present, his boys the babe. She spoke her father, Aaron Vey, who carried the cadence and entered it in his daughter, 3 beats at a kitchen table, the night before the rockfall. The count does not stop for grief, and his fire is in the jar, and she spoke first of the witnesses, as the new form of the line now required and would require forever. Cormac Vey, Speaker the Eighth, who kept the steps through the silent years, and balanced the slate. Then she turned to face the crags, and Selkenshore heard its speaker do the thing the whole new world stood on. The second tally, the Parliament's dead, 300 years, 3 beats and a fall, in the old syllables. From Murith Cloud Counter down the long unbroken architecture of names to Skell, sister of the same wind, the high traverse kept clear 109 years. They buried their dead facing the water, bind to them. At the wall's end, the rust-black witness sat through his sister's house, with his eyes shut and his head bowed into the wind off the sea. And when the count came down to its last and newest name, Ashvaran, Eldest, who held the door, the whole Parliament, ranked along the high galleries in the sun, took up the one held note above the town, and the sound rolled down the cliff and out over the boats like weather made of remembering, and not a soul on that wall ever forgot standing inside it. The count is true, Vargoth said when silence had its place again. The witness's verdict, the first ever rendered. Nothing dropped, nothing softened. And then, because the season had loosened something in the old creature that 106 years had rusted shut, he added, dry as shingle, to the speaker in front of the entire town. Your cadence wandered on Olivar's deed line, keeper, half a beat. I will be listening again next equinox. Half a beat early or late, Tamsin said. Early. Then I'll slow it. Thank you, witness. And the town watched their 14-year-old speaker and the most feared dragon on the coast nod to one, another like 2 old skippers agreeing about the weather. And Selkenshore stopped being afraid of the crags that morning, all at once completely, in the way a town decides things without a word being voted. That evening, with the lamps coming on along the harbor and the smell of the accounting feast all over the lower town, Tamsin slipped out the back of the Vey house, by habit older than any of her new titles, and climbed the gull scramble to the gull step. The chalk marks still covered the shelf wall, 500 and some in their tidy 5s. She had thought, climbing, that she might wash them now. The count had a slate, a wall, a witness, a whole town of cutting crews. The secret ledger had retired. She stood with her hand on the cold rock and found she could no more wash them than she could have washed the grooves off the first speaker's stones, because this was what the boundary stones had been too. The place where somebody kept the count before anybody said they could. Every line needed one. Maybe that was the real office, under all the offices, and the slate, as her grandfather said, was only ever catching up. Stone shifted above her, lightly like a settling roof. She did not startle. She had half expected it for days. The young dragon came down the last reach of the cliff with the careful overdone dignity of the very young everywhere, a gray not yet gone to slate, wings still too big for him, and put himself on the gallery above the gull step, in the exact place where a dying eldest had lain along the rock on 500 evenings, listening to a child say left-out names. Brel, of Seska's brood, youngest sworn of the Parliament. He had sat at the rim of the moot ledge through the whole of the long night of the second tally, she remembered, wide awake, listening, the way she had once listened at a kitchen door. Keeper, he said with immense formality, and then spoiled it entirely by fidgeting his wings. The Parliament did not send me, I am merely. The gallery has a good evening view of the weather. It does, Tamsin agreed gravely. A silence, the fidgeting silence of the young, and then in a rush, when the eldest gave you our dead, the cadence, the houses, the long walking. Someone will have to hold it after you. And after the next eldest. Both tallies and both kinds of keeping, or it rots again, everyone says so, even Vargoth says so. The young dragon's eyes, Ember knew, came down to her, and there it was, the thing under the thing. The oldest question on the shelf, the one her whole life had been the answer to, asked this time from the other side of the dark gap. Will you teach me? Tamsi Yve looked out over her town, the lamps on the water, the new stone course in the harbor wall catching the last light, the crags above with their galleries going gold, and she took the chalk stub out of the tin that she still carried, and always would, and turned to the rock face and made one fresh mark, the first of a new 5. Sit down, Brel, said the keeper of the 2 tallies in the cadence, 3 beats and a fall, the way her father had begun it at a kitchen table, the way it would now begin forever, world without end, on the shelf where nobody could see them, and the count went on. We start where I started. Say the names with me.